Hello, and welcome to the Marlborough Medieval Studies, Section 3, Part 5, the 14th Century Crisis. Today we will be talking about a general economic slowdown and a number of other external factors that play into the economy of the 14th century. This crisis, depending on how you want to see it, is building from sometime in the 13th, but really comes to a head in the 14th, and there are a number of factors that weigh down the economy and result in fairly widespread economic recession or depression throughout the end of the 14th century and continuing into the 15th century. Now, as we talked about last time, from the 10th century onward, for a variety of reasons, the economy begins to pick up. The number of trade routes expand, the number of contacts between places grows, cities are on the increase, there are more and more markets, there's greater penetration of the use of cash and contracts. Banking begins to become more common, and different ways are practiced to essentially produce forms of usury, but allow for capital exchanges and people to use capital to generate more wealth rather than simply needing to use the finances at their disposal. Now, at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century, much of this begins to reverse itself. And certainly the coalitions and the trading powers and the cities that have developed over this time don't disappear overnight. In fact, they don't disappear at all. They persist through the crisis, but there are a number of facets that go into making the 14th century a period of economic reversal, economic decline, and in the end, lots of suffering and hardship. And some of these things are internal to the economy and related directly to the things that actually kick off the beginning of the economy. But at least one of them, the plague that I'm going to talk about, is quite external to the entire life of Europe itself, but it comes in the 14th century and adds to the general sense that this is a time period where there's a lot of suffering. Now, the four aspects that I'm going to talk about are banking, overpopulation, agricultural contraction and climate, and the plague. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how each of those interacts with the broader economic realm within Europe, how it influences people's livelihood and their general outlook, and some of the consequences related to that. So to begin with banking, if you remember when we talked about the 11th and 12th century, one of the things that I noted is that people looked for a growing number of ways to get around the church restriction on usury. The church says that you can't loan money at interest. You are causing money to increase in a synthetic way, which you shouldn't do. Part of it has to do also with the commandment about money changing that Christ mentions in the Gospels. But without going into the theology, they've invented these various ways where they will give a gift to a king, and the king says that he will give a larger gift back within a year's time. But the bank really knows exactly how much that's going to be, and it does amount to loaning money at interest. This had become fairly common by the 13th century. Other forms include contracts where you give a merchant a certain amount of money to go buy goods in a foreign place. That's more capital investment. They come back, they sell it, they earn money off of that. This had become quite common by the 14th century, and one of the things that you start to get are a certain number of banking crises. They will either overextend themselves, they invest in risky goods. Part of this is the greater exposure of Europe itself to the general boom and bust cycle of business. It's known now that these things are somewhat cyclical, that you have periods of expansion and periods of contraction. But business was basically new enough that they weren't always entirely sure what to do with periods of contraction. And today we have much more centralized government control. We have things like the FDIC and the Fed to help mitigate the peaks and troughs, or at least they're supposed to help mitigate the peaks and troughs of that economic cycle. But in the 14th century, those economic cycles really play out in a more chaotic way. And just to give you one example, and this example in some ways looks very modern, and this is the beginning of when things like this begin to happen. One of the things that rulers would frequently take loans out for, now individuals might take loans out to buy a ship or increase their capital or put money into new looms to make more cloth and that sort of thing. But rulers would sometimes take money out to finance war. And war, of course, is a risky business. So during the 100 Years' War, which starts in the early 14th century, goes into the 15th, Edward III of England takes out a huge amount of loans in the 1340s to finance an invasion of France. He takes out almost £150,000 between the two Florentine banks of the Bardi and the Peruzzi. And he gets money from other sources. This is only about half of the money that he raises. Some of it is from his personal estate, some of it is from tax base, and some of it is from other loans that he takes out. But between those two, he takes out this massive quantity that is actually larger than any of the public debt in Europe at the time. It's larger than his own yearly income from his estates, so it's a risky quantity. Now, when he invades France, it goes terribly. It goes completely south, nothing goes right for him, and within a couple of weeks, they turn around and head back to England. Even before his loans have become due to these Italian banks, the news of the failure of his invasion reaches Florence. And just that news is enough for everybody in Florence to make a run on those two banks. They know that suddenly those banks don't have the capital they thought they were going to have. They're probably going to lose a bunch of money. And so everybody goes who has any money with them and says, I need my money back. I would like it now or as soon as possible. And of course, banks don't carry all the money that they have on hand. They carry some percentage of it. And as they start paying it back, very quickly they find that they don't have enough cash to finance that. And so the entire economy of Florence goes into a tailspin. The Peruzzi Bank goes bankrupt in 1343. And in response, the city actually spends some time backing up the coffers of the Bardi. So even the idea of a bank bailout is nothing new. The Florentine government says, well, we can't have this happen to our economy, so we're going to buttress this bank and start paying out the people who come to the bank for their money from city coffers. But in the end, even that is not enough money. The hole that they dug themselves into by financing Edward III's invasion is too deep, and the Bardi go under and bankrupt in 1346. And of course, shortly thereafter, and this is not surprising, Edward III himself declares bankruptcy in 1347. But it's just the news of that is enough to cause this banking crisis, which then becomes a credit crisis and a finance crisis, and a lot of the economy in the city grinds to a halt. Money isn't moving around, people aren't buying goods, so even people who make things like cloth or millers find that they don't have as much business as they would have just a few years before. And this, of course, in some sense looks very modern. It looks a little bit like the run on the banks in the US in 1929 on Black Friday. The efforts of the government to bolster a bank are something that obviously we continue to do, that continues to be contentious. But this boom and bust cycle is something that is really becoming wilder in the 14th century. The peaks and valleys are getting a little bit steeper, and this is causing more chaos in general in the economy. So the second one that I want to look at briefly is the plague. And the plague, there was a time when actually people suggested that the plague might not be external to the economy, that it was possible that because of harvest failures in the first part of the 14th century, that when the plague arrives in 1348, that it arrives and hits a weakened population, and that's part of the reason it's so bad. Well, there's some plausibility to this. Certainly weaker populations, people that are less well-fed, are more likely to die of disease. It doesn't really help explain the depth of the ravishing of the plague in the middle of the 14th century, and especially the fact that it continues. So in some ways, the plague is best seen as an external factor. It's hard to predict when a disease like this will be this bad. That's also one of the interesting features you see comparing the plague to other known epidemics. The plague is caused by Yersinia pestis. It's a bacteria that actually you can still get in parts of California, Arizona, New Mexico. Squirrels and chipmunks, some other forest creatures will still carry the disease through the fleas that they have, which is how it was probably initially spread in 1348. But one of the difficulties is that there was a big outbreak of plague in India at the end of the 19th century, but that plague only kills 5%, maybe 10% of the places that it reaches. Again, some of that depends on their sanitation, how well fed they are, and questions like that. But suffice to say, those death levels are still quite low compared to what we see in Europe. Now, in 1348, the first wave of the plague arrives, and you can see in the map, our best guess is that it arrives from the Crimean in the north of the Black Sea. It is spread by trading ships, probably Genoese trading ships, to Italy and other parts of the Mediterranean coast. It then makes its way northward around to the other side of Spain, through France and England, Central Europe, and eventually loops back all the way around through Germany, the North Sea, parts of Russia. And eventually this hits the majority, although not absolutely all, of Europe. But some of the death rates are really astonishing. They vary anywhere from 25%, sometimes as high as 50%. Some people peg it a little bit lower. Some estimates say a third. It's hard to know exactly, in part because we don't know how many people there were to begin with. But I myself, 25% at least seems fairly likely, especially given some of the descriptions we have of just how many people died. Now, the legendary origins of this are that the Mongols, when they lay siege to one of the Genoese cities on the Black Sea, tossed corpses off of their catapults into the city, and the corpses brought the contagion or the infection with them that then infected everybody in the city and was eventually brought back to Italy on ships, knowing now that this is probably a disease spread by fleas and by flea bites and the bacteria that is in their bites. It's likely that this came aboard with rats onto the ships, and that the rat population then carries it to new flea and rat populations wherever they go, which then spread to people. This is complicated by the fact that plague really has two different manifestations. There's the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague. And the difference is not so much in their symptoms and how they manifest themselves, but in how they're transmitted. Bubonic plague we generally think of as only being transmitted by fleas, but in certain virulent cases, human beings will get enough of it in their lungs that it will then transmit itself through droplet as you cough. And once it transmits through droplet, you get a human-to-human vector. It can spread much quicker. The cases of droplet contagion, when you get it into your lungs like that, tend to be much more fatal. So it seems likely that might help account for this very, very high death rate. But again, it's not entirely certain that the death rate should be that high just from plague, because as I said, the modern plagues don't have that similarly dreadful 1 in 4 rate of death. But that said, 1348 to 1352, Europe loses almost a quarter of its population, and the plague actually continues to come back. It continues. Every 20 or so years, there'll be another revival of the plague. And this actually continues into the 17th century. There's a famous visitation of London. The book Journal of a Plague Year is about one of these last visitations of the plague in London and the effects that it has on that city. So this is something that then becomes a recurring part of European life over the next couple of centuries. It also helps ensure a general downward trend in demography, really starting at the beginning of the 14th century, and I'll talk more about demography in just a second, but through the 15th century, the population stays slumped and has a harder time recovering to where it was even in the 13th century until more than 100 years later. Now, the third aspect that probably contributes at least a little bit to the retraction of the European economy has to do with agricultural production. Now, I mentioned that the climate, the medieval optimum, starts 10th, 11th century. By the 11th century, the climate is generally warming up, making Northern Europe a little more hospitable. The agricultural year extends a little bit. In the 14th century, this also reverses itself, and we enter a long period of cooling. Now, this alone is not necessarily enough to kick off a crisis, because, of course, the climate will change very, very slowly, but you start to get more rainy winters, or rainy summers and colder, snowier winters in Northern Europe. You get a little more drought in the Mediterranean in the 14th century. As the climate cools off from its 12th century peak, this will eventually culminate in what is called the Little Ice Age. So from the 16th and 17th century, the climate reaches a point where it is cooler than it has been in several centuries. Agriculture contracts throughout Europe. There are a number of known food riots in that century. There are some scholars that see the climate really driving what is known as the 17th century crisis. This is the 14th century crisis. But the 17th century crisis has some similar overlaps: cooler climate, a larger number of grain riots, political unrest, uncertainty in how people will earn their livelihood, and the state of the economy more generally. Then after the 17th century, of course, the climate begins warming up, and it is still warming up today. I won't go into that. But suffice to say, in the 14th century, this may be one of the things that at least helps tip the balance towards the entire century seeming like one of crisis, seeming like one of a perpetual set of difficulties. That even as banks are beginning to have larger busts and economies have more self-inflicted difficulties, that the climate is not helping out. The amount of production and the amount of wealth being generated in Europe is at least beginning to drop ever so slightly because of the change in climate. So turning to our last point, and this will set up what is essentially part 2 of this discussion, in which I will talk about some of my dissertation research. Now I'll talk a little bit about demography. Now, the demography argument really started about 50 years ago, and it came in response to the idea that the crisis of the 14th century, or the disastrous 14th century, was kicked off by the plague. And then after the plague and the loss of 25% of the population, that the European economy then suffered for 100 years after that. The continuing revisiting of the plague is what really brought them down. But 50 years ago, started really by the scholar Michael Postan, but then picked up by a number of other scholars, Georges Duby in particular, but Emmanuel Laura-Ladurie, a Frenchman, and a number of other writers, looked at the 13th century and said, well, actually, the economy seems to be slowing down at the tail end of the 13th century. The growth that we see in the 11th and 12th century was not sustained through the 13th. Trade is either leveling off, population is probably leveling off, and in some instances the population by the early 14th century might already be dropping. So the plague then is a precipitous fall off of a cliff of a line that is already going down, rather than a constant upswing that is interrupted by the appearance of the plague. And the main reason that these scholars give for that is a demographic argument. It's what is commonly referred to as a Malthusian argument, after the British moralist and political economist Thomas Malthus, who basically said that human beings will reach a carrying capacity of the land that they are on, and a whole host of economic and social changes will then come about when there are too many people. Food prices will go up continually. Famine will eventually become more common. People will suffer more in the famines that there are. Because of the overabundance of people, the wages will start to drop. And so people begin to look at this in the early 14th century, and some of the evidence that they supply shows that things like the amount of land inherited from father to son in rural England amongst peasants is shrinking. The amount of land that somebody has to live off is shrinking, which means that their surplus budget, their overall livelihood, to some extent their general health and well-being is suffering as they are forced to do with slightly less food and slightly less slightly lower quality of food as well, based on what one can grow in a given space. This view is supported to some extent by the fact that after the Black Death, one of the things that you immediately see in the economy is the number of people moving towards cities goes up very, very quickly, and the wages that people get paid correspondingly go up. Now, this is most true in England, but what this seems to imply is that when the population suddenly drops, the percentage of people's diets that they can afford to eat meat improves, their overall wage improves, and livelihoods are better in a smaller population regime than in a very densely populated regime, as people have seen and as scholars have demonstrated at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century. Now, one of the biggest pieces of proof for this has always been the famine of 1315. And in some ways, this famine is one of the worst famines ever recorded. It covers everywhere in Northern Europe, from Ireland over to Poland and possibly further east. It covers everything from the Alps northward to Iceland and Scandinavia. It involves both a couple of years of really rainy winters and actually 1 year of a very rainy summer as well, so that everything in the field is sogged, there's too much rain, there's not enough sunlight, it's overcast so often that the crops never manage to mature. At the same time as you have this overcast, rainy weather, that also impedes salt production, so the ability to store meat and fish is also impeded. So it strikes a number of food sources all at the same time. And just a couple of years after this, the reason that it's 1315 to 1322 in some sense is that a couple of years after these really wet years, you have a series of cattle and sheep epidemics. Most notably, you get a disease called rinderpest that is pretty nasty and can kill as many as half of a cattle population. It leaves the ones that do survive fairly weak. Sometimes it can have even higher death rates than that, so it really decimates the cattle population. It's particularly bad in England, but it's bad in a lot of other parts of Northern Europe as well. And what this does is that it reduces the availability of animal traction, it reduces the availability of animal protein, it reduces the amount of manure available for fields, right at a time when the fields are only beginning to recover from their couple of years of bad production. So between this, you see very, very widespread starvation, you see families that break apart, and some of the families will try to move to new locations, but of course the famine is widespread enough that you can't really just walk away from it. And by some estimates, as many as 5% of the people died, and you'll notice immediately that famines don't kill traditionally as many people as epidemics. Disease is a much more effective killer of human beings than starvation. We can go kind of a long time with little or no food and still recover, although obviously it's neither pleasant nor good for us. But disease is much more effective at killing large amounts of people, hence the 25% for the plague, but only 5% for the Great Famine. Some people put that as high as 10%. Again, demography, it's very, very difficult to know. But even that spread of 5 to 10% is well below the plague spread of 15 to as high as 50%, depending on who you ask. Now, this argument from demography also relies on the fairly low crop yields that I talked about a couple of lectures ago, that you might have 3, 4, even 5 to 1 on an average year, but that meant that if your production was cut in half, if you had to pay anything to the Lord, you would not even have enough seed to replant in the following year. And that also then begins to determine how much land a person needs to live on. So these shrinking plots of land become all the more grievous if you think that the production of that land is fairly low. People also look at the amount of animals that somebody owns, because of course it takes a little bit more land to own an animal, although animals are ultimately beneficial for the land because of manuring practices and animal traction for plowing. But looking at falling numbers of animals, shrinking plots, and one of the other arguments that gets put forward is that the soil has been exhausted. As people are pressured to take over more and more marginal land throughout Europe, if all of the good land is already taken, you might go and find a piece of woodland or marshland that is not being farmed. Initially, you can cut down the trees, you might get a few good harvests out of it, but it is not ideal agricultural land. That land has now disappeared by the beginning of the 14th century. There are people everywhere. That's basically how the argument goes. And so because of that, by the beginning of the 14th century, a lot of these marginal lands are either exhausted, they're being put through a 2-field rotation when they would be better off with a 3, but the person can't afford to do a 3 because the amount of land that they have is so little that they need the most they can produce every year just to survive that year. So that then paints a picture of Northern Europe in which there are too many people, the land that they're using is not very good, It is dried up of its resources, so it is not able to produce as much as it was 50 years ago. All of this puts it very much on the edge of a precipice, ripe for a famine event that comes in 1315, knocks the population down a little bit, but also famines, of course, reduce the amount of excess food or surplus food that the nobility has. So if you remember the argument that one of the reasons that the economic takeoff happens is that people have more money to purchase luxury products, famines pretty much ensure that nobody has money for luxury products. Even wealthier nobles, although they are unlikely to outright starve, they do complain that the assets of their property, the amount of money that they gain from the rent from their peasants and their ownership in mills, obviously the less grain being ground means the less tariff income that they are gaining from that. So everybody takes a big economic hit, and it has wide repercussions across the continent. So 7 bad years is enough to tip the entire economy into something of a recession that then persists up until the Black Death. And if you notice, the banking crises in the 40s are coming in this period of declining economy for the entire continent. So that's an introduction to the 14th century crisis. Part 2 of this lecture will be the look at my dissertation and my actual research that I continue to do. And I have really 2 main pieces of that in some ways they don't entirely undermine the overpopulation argument of the beginning of the 14th century, but they are caveats to that argument, particularly as regards how we understand famine and how we understand the relationship of agricultural crisis to the wider economy. And the 2 main things that I will talk about in that are how crop yields are measured and what we know about crop yields, and some of the evidence that I have about why crop yields in a given piece of land might be really low or might be somewhat higher. And the second half of that is the economic play out of a famine in a time of lower population. The main famine that I studied for my dissertation is in 1374. It is after the Black Death. It is in a time period when the European population has slumped dramatically. So it doesn't look like the Great Famine of 1315. It's much harder to argue that it fits neatly into this neo-Malthusian model in which rising numbers of people, falling amounts of land per person, use of marginal land puts the European population at the edge of a precipice about to fall off into starvation. So I look at how a famine actually occurs, and 1374 is generally considered to be a very bad famine. How it occurs in a time period in which it's difficult to say that the population of 1374 is more at risk than they were 30 years ago, because of course the population has dropped 25%, perhaps a third since then. So that will be part 2.